Welcome to another episode of Threads of Enlightenment. And as usual, what we do here is I first want to welcome our guest, Jim, to come to us. And I thank you for sharing your time, your energy, your wisdom, sir, with us, that you're here to guide us from your journey so that we can become better human spirits while we are here on this planet. Jim, I want to thank you for coming, sir. Thank you again for coming to Threads of Enlightenment.
You're very welcome.
Oh, you're welcome. I want you to tell them, Jim, talk to them about what you have. I always say to people that creators will always be on the move. And the things that they have today is a byproduct of their journey. So I want you to tell them, Jim, educate them as to what you picked up in your journey, and then we'll walk you through it.
Okay. I am the discoverer of hitherto unknown human phenomena, from which I constructed a revolutionary philosophic system called Septemics, and which I published in a book called Septemics, Hierarchies of Human Phenomena. This book would dramatically improve the life of anyone who takes advantage of it. That means anyone who can read English and anyone who wants to improve himself or his life will benefit from this book. I already know that because I worked on this book for 25 years before I published it. And I've seen the results. If you were to go to my website, septemics.com, septemics.com, you'll see what readers have said about it, what writers have written about it. You'll see reviews and so forth, and also sections of the book. So I have a very long track record of this subject. So it's a known quantity to me. There's no speculation involved in this. And that's why I spent so much time working on it. Because I'm an engineer. And in the world of engineering, whatever you create must work. That is what is important. And I know that the system works. As for my qualifications, I'm a polymathic intellectual whose areas of expertise include psychology, philosophy, theology, parapsychology, science, engineering, mathematics, law, literature, history, metaphysics, military science, political science, organization, physical culture, education, and music. And I hold a Bachelor of Science cum laude from City University of New York. As for Septemics, Septemics is a philosophical science based on the fact that many phenomena related to human beings occur in a sequence of 7 levels. Literally, the word Septemics means of or pertaining to 7. Septemics comprises a collection of sequences or scales, each of which breaks down various human phenomena into a hierarchy of 7 steps. There are 35 such scales which span the spectrum of human experience. And what I mean by that is there is no situation that is going to arise in the life of a human that does not respond to one or more of these scales. I've already established that. There are 35 such scales which break down into 24 which apply primarily to individuals and 11 which apply primarily to groups. Now, I wrote this book to help people. I had a long career as a human development engineer where I helped hundreds of people over many decades to improve themselves. And that is what led me eventually to finding this subject, which I'll tell you about later. So now I'm sort of going from helping hundreds to helping millions, because I want this book to be in the hands of as many people as possible. Because anybody who wants to improve himself or his life, who can read English, will get benefit from this book. And the more you put into it, the more you will get out of it. Each of these 35 scales provides the user with an infallible way of determining the salutariness or beneficialness of any group, individual, or activity. If the group, individual, or activity moves persons or groups up these scales, it's beneficial or positive. If it moves them down, it's detrimental or negative. Moreover, just finding out what level you, another person, or some group is at is by itself enlightening and beneficial. Finally, once you know the actual level of a person or group, you can improve that person or group, whether it's yourself or another, by moving them up one level at a time. One of the axioms of Septemics is that you can never skip a level. Now, sometimes it may seem you skipped a level, but that's only an apparency. If it goes by quickly or easily, it seems you skipped a level, but you never skip a level. It's impossible. It's just like if you're on the first floor and you want to go to the fifth floor, one way or another, you have to go through the second, the third, and the fourth. Whether you take the escalator, the elevator, a rope ladder, or whatever. And that's how this works. Now, this solves an age-old problem, which is the gradient problem. Many people know what their situation is, what their problem is, but they don't know how to fix it. And that's usually because they don't know the gradient. In other words, crash diets and crash exercise programs do not work because nobody can lose 100 pounds. You can lose 1 pound 100 times, and that's the gradient. Or I've worked as a trainer. You can't just give a guy 100 pounds and say, work out with that. That's not good training. A good trainer, like any good teacher or counselor, knows the right gradient. He elicits it from the client, and he gets the person working on the right thing. If the guy can curl 20 pounds 15 times, that's a good place to start. So this solves the gradient problem across the spectrum. In other words, it doesn't matter what situation you're trying to resolve, whether it's financial, romantic, familial, governmental, business, they all resolve according to these scales. Now, you have to realize that every scale is unique. So you can't learn anything really about scale A by studying scale B. You can't learn about scale C by studying scale D. Each one is unique. And if you think about it, in order to have a subject that spans the spectrum of human experience, you would have to have 35 unique scales because human phenomena is vast. And if I read to you the names of the scales, you would see exactly what I mean. Because these 35 different names correspond to the 35 different scales, and it pretty much covers everything because each one of these things is vast and huge. You actually could take any one of these scales almost at random and completely improve your life just using the one scale. I don't recommend that, but you could do that. And actually the way that works out is a person will have a situation and will say, I see, this scale explains my situation. And he will then find himself there. Then he knows exactly where he is in relative to this situation. And then he can move himself up one level and he has improved his life.
That is awesome.
So all of these advantages represent major steps forward for society. Each of these scales represents an axis against which to evaluate human behavior and phenomena. Combined, they empower one to understand, predict, and manage human affairs to a degree hitherto unattainable by most. The data in this book are vital for every human being and can help you to achieve your goals faster and easier by explaining what might otherwise seem to be inexplicable or random. If someone were to invite you to a rendezvous, you would certainly expect them to tell you the exact location and perhaps also how to get there. Needless to say, it's very difficult to get somewhere if you don't know where you are, don't know where you're going, and don't know how to get to your destination. Now, this sounds idiotic, but most people do this regularly. Long before GPS units, when I started driving on location, I started finding out that most people did not know geographically precisely where they were. My request for directions from the person on the other end of the phone was usually required by vague and often inaccurate data. So I learned to ask only for an address, which most people couldn't give, or many people couldn't give anyway. And I would look it up on a map. Now, if this is true with physical phenomena, it's even more true with conceptual phenomena because they are abstract. So this book helps you to find where you are in any one of 35 different categories and move yourself up. Because when you find the level, it's fairly easy usually to move yourself up to the next level. But even if you don't move yourself up, just knowing what level you're at is an epiphany. Or as one reviewer said, it's an eye-opener.
So, Jim, that's I love what you're talking about and what you have discovered. Now, I want to go back, Jim, as to your childhood because we want to get a glimpse of your journey and where did this come out of, all of this wisdom, this insight that you've received. How did it come out of this being? Talk to us about your childhood as to what type of family you were brought up in and that kind of thing, siblings, those.
Okay, so let me tell you, I was a born polymath. I have no memory of a time when I was not intensely interested in learning any legitimate subject. I mean, I'm not interested in knowing trivial things like how much change you have in your pocket. But anything that's taught in a university, I want to know. That's how I was born. I can remember at the age of 3 being like that, being inquisitive and being compelled to learn. I started school at the age of 3, and I have been active in pedagogy one way or another my entire life. So teaching and learning is inherent to my personality. Now, when I was 10, I was shocked to find that some kids didn't like school. I could not fathom that. I loved school. Okay? And I was enthused to go to school every day and learn something new. And I'm still like that. Still like that. Now we have search engines. It's easy. So if I have some abstruse question, you know, like what religion did a certain author practice? You know, I can look that up and find it, which is a great improvement because, of course, when I was young, you had to go to libraries and you had to go through card catalog. It was not easy to find out things, especially specific things and abstruse things, which is something that I'm always interested in. Now, so I became a very good student. I was an honor student and I went to elite schools and won scholarships and graduated with honors and all of that. And by the time I had my bachelor's degree, I accomplished a couple of things. One is I pretty much knew what the mainstream had. In other words, I knew what the mainstream was offering. Mathematics, chemistry, history, and so forth. And I saw that there were vast gaps in there. There are all kinds of things that were not available, things I wanted to know. The other thing is, by the time I finished my bachelor's degree, I knew that I did not want to engineer electrons and airfoils and motors and things like that. I wanted to engineer the human psyche. And as a child, I was very interested in anything like the Twilight Zone or One Step Beyond or The Outer Limits. So after I got my bachelor's degree, instead of going to graduate school, which is what I always thought I was going to do, I started studying alternative subjects and saying, you know, looking under different rocks. What do these people know? What do these people have? Why is there a group here? Why is there a religion here? And all of that opened my mind, to put it one way, or to put it another way, it answered a lot of the questions that I had that the mainstream did not answer. So the other thing that happened by the time I was a Bachelor of Science is that I really knew how to study. I knew that better than I knew anything else. I knew how to learn. This was not an unknown to me. So by then, I could go into any field, any subject without a teacher and master it because I knew how to access the material, how to study, and some of that is in the book. There's a scale of scholarship, which talks about the 7 levels of scholarship and how to move people up to become a better scholar. There's also a scale of literacy, which is similar but related. Okay, so now I developed a career as a human development engineer, and I'm working with my clients, for decades, hundreds of people of every type. And here's what happened. I started observing that when my clients improved, they improved in ways that were predictable to me. Now, I never said this to anyone, but I made notes on it. I observed that they were moving up scales. In other words, I would take a guy in, I would know the subject material, I would know the client, and I would know before he had his realization or his epiphany what it was going to be. Because I knew these scales that I had observed empirically, just from dealing with a lot of people, and I wrote them down. Now, eventually I had about 32 scales of various numbers. Only 1 or 2 of them actually had 7 levels. But there was one scale in particular that was extremely important and relevant that permeated everything I experienced. Eventually, this came to be known as the scale of basic purposes. Every human being has only one of 7 basic purposes. Now, of course, everyone has thousands of purposes. If you want to get a cup of coffee, that's a purpose. But there's only one basic purpose, and that generally persists for your whole life. Now, there are exceptions. There are people who can move up one level or down one level in extreme circumstances. But most people stay at one level. So when you know somebody's basic purpose, you know all about him. You know what he's trying to do. And when you know your own basic purpose, it's extremely enlightening. It makes living much easier because you know what you're about and what you're not about. Those other 6 things are not what you're about. You're about this one thing. Now, this scale of basic purposes came from a 6-level scale, which I had been using for decades, and I knew was correct. I saw it working everywhere I looked. However, in 1995, I discovered a 7th level. And when I inserted that 7th level into the 6-level scale, it clicked in mathematically. And I realized I was looking at natural law. I realized, whoa, this is much bigger than anything I was contemplating. So then I thought, I wonder how many of these other scales that I have observed and written down are actually 7-level scales. And because I knew what I was looking for, it was not hard for me to find the remaining levels on these other 30 or so scales. Voila! In a couple of months, I had about 32 7-level scales. And as I found the 7 levels, they all manifested mathematically. Now, when you read the book, it's not like studying a math book. The mathematics is not obvious in the book because I'm not trying to make a mathematician. I'm trying to teach the scales. But to me, as an engineer who had 26 semesters of math, I could see the math, and I have a mathematical mind. And something else that I can tell you is, for me, what's important is knowledge. That is inherently valuable. I'm not interested in fame, power, wealth, or anything else like that. I'm interested in knowledge. I want to know, whatever it is. Okay? Now, most people are mixed up in that area. They confuse knowledge with understanding, with opinion. Those are 3 different things. Okay? Now, I know that the Pythagorean theorem is true. It was true before Earth existed, and it will be true after Earth no longer exists. Okay? It is embedded in the fabric of the universe. And if you understand it well, most math is. Math is almost entirely embedded in the fabric of the universe. I think of math as God's language. It's the closest humans can get to a divine apprehension of reality because it is inarguable. So I see great beauty in math, and I see mathematics in everything I look at. If I'm driving a car, I see mathematical formulas going in front of me. Okay, so, and this makes my mind very precise. And one of the outgrowths of this is I have an ability to perceive that is apparently superior to most people's. And the way I know that is I can be in a room with 10 people, something happens, and I perceive things about that the other people don't see. And as I went forward, this got more and more extreme. Now, the other thing I should tell you is that I've been meditating since I was a young man. So I've been meditating my whole life. I've been meditating thousands and thousands of hours. I still meditate about an hour a day. And I very, very rarely miss a day. For me to miss a day, it has to be some kind of a disaster. You know, like the house is on fire, you know, or my son's in the hospital or something like that. It's got to be big because that is really the most important thing to me because it clears my mind. So
Place of power,
instead of my mind being
I tell
turbulent,
people it's a place of power. I tell people meditation is a place of power. If you understand the purpose of it, and I think in many cases like yourself, I think math is the purest form of communication because I think when you look at the planet and the preciseness of it all, I think math is the purest form of communication that one can express. When you're looking at everything on a global scale, from the axis on the moon, I mean, everything, Jim, stands. So you're absolutely right. When we're long gone, the math will still be here. Those formulas will still be here. They've never left. They've always been here. It's just you and I and people are through time are gaining access to it by a shifting of the mind, our perception, so that we can understand it, and then we were able to put it down on paper. But I love the stuff that you're talking about. This is really good stuff. Jim, I wanted to talk to you about, okay, how did you, with all of this going around and you're able to perceive things, how did you fit into this place, this space that we call Earth at the time when you're dealing with the people around you that are not that are not aware or gifted with your perceptiveness in your living? How did you relate to other people? Because that's what you're talking about. Your lifestyle can be if a lonely place. So talk to me about how did you interact with people and with this knowledge, and how was that, Jim?
Well, I wouldn't say for me it was a lonely place, but I was sort of a weirdo or an outsider. Yeah. So I was always sort of outside of society, studying it the way a scientist would study a specimen, you know, under a microscope, because I was sort of outside it. I didn't particularly want to be outside it, but I was. And to give you an example of what I mean, by the time I was a teenager, I had different groups of friends. I had one group of friends with whom I would attend physics lectures and math lectures. I had another group of friends with whom I would attend classical Greek plays and poetry readings. I had another group of friends with whom I would play football and baseball. These three groups of people hated one another. There was no crossover. Now, I had no trouble dealing with all groups of these people, but I learned at an early age that I needed to keep them separate because they were not going to tolerate one another. They could tolerate me because I could discuss whatever they were into. Like I had one friend who eventually became a physicist, and he was in some ways like a dopey, dorky nerd, okay? But when it came to like math and physics, he was like a genius. You know, I mean, he had trouble getting high grades in English and Latin and things like that in history. But math and science, he was like close to 100 all the time. And that's just an example. So I could hang out with him, and I had other friends who did everything they could to get away from math and science. But with them, I could discuss classical literature, for example. And this is what I mean when I said I was a born polymath. So in a way, I was an outsider, but it sort of worked for me because I could relate to all these different people, even though none of them could completely accept me. You know, like if I told my theater buddies that I loved math, they would just look at me like I was from Mars. So, you know, or if I told my science and math buddies that I had just been to a classical Greek play, they would say, "Why would you want to do that?" You know, so all of this turned out to be a big advantage to me as a human development engineer, because I had a scope and a breadth. And because the meditation cumulatively calmed my mind, as the years went by, my ability to perceive got better and better and better and better, because most people's minds are turbulent. That's why they get upset. That's why they worry. That's why they're insecure. I don't have any of that. I almost never get upset. You know, when my mother died, I didn't get upset. I just said, well, okay, well, she's old. She lived to 93 and she's going on to heaven, you know. Didn't bother me. And so very few things worry me or upset me because I've spent so much time clearing my mind. And that made me, my ability to perceive better and better. And that made me a really good human development engineer, because I would get a complete stranger come to me and say, you know, I've got this going on with my wife. I don't know what to do. You know, and as they were telling me, I would be having insights into it that they did not have. And I didn't tell them what they were, because my role was to bring the person to figure it out himself. That's what Socratic dialogue is. If you study Socrates, he would have a long conversation with somebody, and the guy would be having realizations during the conversation because Socrates would ask the right question. And that's what I was good at. Now, sometimes the question would take the form of a statement, like, tell me your problem. That's not really a question. It's more like a request, but in a sense, it's like a question. So because of that, I started observing these phenomena and I wrote them down, and eventually I discovered a new subject. Because when I saw that I had 32 scales that were all mathematical in nature, and they were all empirically proven, I knew that I had something big. Now, when I released the very first transcript of this in 1995 to colleagues of mine, brilliant people who all had graduate degrees in different fields, they were all blown away by this. Nobody said, I don't really get it, or anything like that. Nobody said that. So then I started giving it to my clients, and I started giving it to my friends. And I started getting 100% positive response. And I can tell you now, it's been 26 years since I started writing the book. And every single person who has either read the book or discussed it with me, as you are doing now, has had a sort of a blown away response, like, wow, I got to read this book. This is what I need. So that's my mission. I've sort of retired as human development engineer. Once the book was published about a little over a year ago, I said, I have to get this out. Now you have to realize it would have been very easy for me to write an academic book that would have been palatable to professors and intellectuals and such. But I was determined to make this available to the people of Earth, or at least the people of Earth who wanted to improve themselves. Because believe me, there are people who don't want to improve themselves. You know, there are people who are after alcohol and drugs and sex and money and stuff like that. They don't care. But they're not going to read this book anyway. But it's for people who want to improve themselves or their lives. And so because of that, I had to put 25 years into it, because first I had to discover the phenomena, then I had to construct the system, and then I had to express it in a way that would make sense to almost anyone who could read English. And so it's a 86,000 word book. I had to go through every single word and say, is this the best way to express it that people will connect with? And I tried not to use words like quotidian and antediluvian, which was how I tend to speak anyway. But I tried to simplify things and say it in a way so that almost anybody can get it. And they do. For example, I have a client who's a corrections officer. All right? No college. Now, he got it. His life was changed by this book. So we're talking about something that works all the way for people who have doctorates, all the way down to people who have a high school education. Now, people who are barely literate, they're going to have trouble with this book. But those people have trouble with any book. And I can tell you from the scale of literacy, which is one of the scales in the book, there are not, people think in terms of literate and illiterate. No, there are 7 levels of literacy. And there are many people with graduate degrees who are not terribly literate. For example, I have a friend who's a doctor. Just socially, I read a book, I liked it. I said, here, read this. This is a great book. Novel. So about a week or two later, she gave it back to me and she said, I can't read this book. Now we're talking about a successful doctor, okay, who had a successful practice and was by societal standards well educated. Could not read. This is one of the most famous novels in the world, okay? Couldn't read it. So thinking that just because people have college degrees or even graduate degrees, that does not make them literate. So the more literate you are, of course, the easier any book is for you. But I want to say, to allay any fears people might have, every single chapter has a glossary in front of it, and even the introduction has a glossary. The introduction is the longest section of the book. And so I am reducing the semantic barrier by putting these glossaries in, which of course was a lot of work, to make 36 glossaries and again, I don't want to turn it into a synonym study, because that could happen from somebody like me. But, so I wanted to make it a limited glossary and focus on the things that people really need to know, like the words in the scales themselves. For example, there's a scale of communication, very important, life-changing scale. If you look up the word communication, you'll see it has about 35 definitions. So anybody could say, well, what definition does he mean when he says the scale of communication? So I have one definition of communication, okay, out of a lexicon, okay? So there's no ambiguity. I was very careful. And remember, as an engineer, you don't want there to be ambiguity. You want things to be clear. Okay.
So here you've done this work, this body of work, and I am actually going to get a copy of it. And anyone that is listening to us, I want you guys to purchase this book, get it for someone Get it for yourself. Get it for someone you care about, that you love, that you are seeing in a difficult place and has been there for a while. Purchase this book because it will guide them out of their situation, and that is the purpose of Threads of Enlightenment. It is to provide space by which someone like Jim can come and can get to you guys the information that is necessary to help you move forward and change your life. Jim, I want to take you back a little right here and bring you back to that conversation that you had talked about the seventh level when you found the first one. I know that's a series of things that happen, but talk to me, if you can, about that specific time, if you can remember the opening that you received and the circumstances that caused it. When you go, bam, oh yeah, and it changed your life as well.
Okay. So first of all, remember I said I had a 6-level scale that I knew was correct. And remember, when I say no, I mean no the way I know that two sides of an isosceles triangle are equal. Or that I know that in a right triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I know that. I know that the acceleration of gravity near the surface of the Earth is 32 feet per second. Okay? That's what I mean by no. If you ask me if I know who's president of the United States, I would say, well, I understand it's Joe Biden. See, I wouldn't use the word no, because although all of the data suggests that, it's not at the same level as the periodic table. Okay? I know. I was a serious chemistry student, and I know that the periodic table is correct. It was correct before Mendeleev discovered it, and it will always be correct. Okay? He put all the elements, all the known elements onto one page, which is the closest thing that I can compare my scales to. Each one of these scales is expressed in a table, or you might say a spreadsheet or a matrix. So you have to look at it the same way you would look at the periodic table. Talking about the periodic table is not helpful. You need to give it to somebody and say, look at this. And you see how these go down and these go across like that. So it's just like if you're teaching math, you have to draw it out. You have to show the formula. Just talking about it it's not like discussing literature. You know, I could discuss with you my favorite writers like Dostoevsky or Thomas Mann, or that's discussing. That is a different thing. But when we're talking about knowledge, you have to really write it out. You have to write out the formula, and then you have to understand the formula, which is done usually in a very graphic way in math. So what happened was, this 6-level scale that I knew was correct, when I put the 7th level in, it became mathematical, and then it opened my eyes to that I had discovered something. Now, the reason it took me so long to discover the 7th level is it makes no sense. This scale is what I now call the scale of basic purposes. It took me years, in fact, it took me decades to divine what axis is this. In other words, I knew the steps, but I did not know the thread of enlightenment that went through it. So it took me years to use these and study them and discuss them to figure out what axis this really is. So eventually I realized it's the scale of basic purposes, which is the most important scale there is. Now, that level, which I discovered in 1995, is level 5 of that scale. And each of those levels has a name. And going from the top to the bottom, the highest basic purpose is the saint. His purpose is to transcend. Below that is the leader. His purpose is conquest. Now, many people think of conquest in a negative context, but it depends on whose ox is being gored. I mean, when the Allies conquered the Axis powers in 1945, that was a good conquest. Even for the people who lived in Japan and Germany and Italy, it was a good conquest. So a conquest can be good or bad, but that's what the leader is about. Now, below that is the winner. The winner is interested in feathering his nest. He wants more money, more custom-made suits, more recognition, better ratings on his TV show, whatever it is, whatever winning means to him. He wants to win. You know, Ross Perot, when he was running for president, he famously said, if you're hiring somebody, look for somebody who wants to win. Now, this was before I had discovered this seventh level, see? So it rang a bell for me because I knew about the winner level. Now, below that is what we call the normal, and that is the most numerous group. And if you watch reruns of Ozzie and Harriet, it's all about normal people. You know, they have a house, they have a car, they have a job, they have kids, they belong to the Elks Club. They're not trying to set the world on fire or conquer anything, okay? They're normal. Below that is the fifth level, which is the loser. Now, the reason that the loser makes no sense is the purpose of the loser is to suffer. Now, this will ring a bell with a lot of people because the loser is not just the person who's doing badly. It's a person who's inherently self-destructive. These people will find some way to sabotage themselves. That's what they do. Whether it's with drugs, alcohol, they end up in prison, they end up in an insane asylum, they end up homeless, they end up in bankruptcy court, they get sued by people, they get arrested. They figure out ways to wreck their own lives. And there's nothing anybody can do about it. Trust me on this. I've watched this as a human development engineer, and once I knew this level, it was easy for me to look around and see this. And I can tell you all kinds of stories that point this out. But this is bad news for do-gooders who think everybody can be helped. First of all, the do-gooders should talk to the mental health people because the mental health people have known for decades that a sociopath, a psychopath will not improve in therapy. That is an established fact. They know that because the lights are on, but nobody's home. It's what I said before. They're not interested in improving themselves. If you go into therapy, you have to be willing to improve yourself. And in order to do that, you have to inspect yourself. You have to say, what am I really doing? Is this really good? And people like that do not have that level of insight. So below the fifth level is the sixth level, which is the criminal. People understand this. This guy is out for himself. Now, criminals do not particularly want to kill people, harm people, but they do it because it's expedient. In other words, if a guy's a drug dealer and you cut in on his turf, he'll kill you because you're taking money away from him. Okay? That's what criminals do. And below that is the lowest level of all, which is the subversive. The purpose of the subversive is to destroy. Now, again, this does not make any sense to most people. Most people try to infer to subversives other motives or other objectives. But if you study somebody like Hitler, who was a subversive, or Pol Pot, who was a subversive, you can say that they were destructive. They were destructive to their own causes, their own people. You know, Hitler, if he were not destructive, he could have won World War II. He basically had it in 1940 when he was fighting only the English. He could have won. And the thing that stood in his way was the fact that Winston Churchill came to power, and Winston Churchill is a leader, and leaders want to conquer. Churchill had been saying for 10 years, this guy Hitler is a danger, he must be stopped. Finally, after the English won the war, then he became prime minister, and then he was able to pursue
Yeah.
this agenda. So if Churchill had not come to power, the English would have surrendered. And that's what the Germans want. The Germans did not hate the English the way they hated the Russians. The Nazis hate communists. They hate them. Not only that, they look down on Slavic peoples as inferior. And the Russians were both Slavic and communists. So they hated them intensely. And that hatred led Hitler to attack the Soviets, even though they had a non-aggression pact in place, and that caused them to lose the war. Of course, the Russians lost 20 million people. They just kept sending people. It's a big country, 11 time zones, 11,000 miles of people. They just kept sending them, and the Germans kept killing them. But, for example, in Stalingrad, the Russians expected to take it in a few weeks. They never took it because the winter came and they froze to death. So that's a perfect example of how a destructive person is going to destroy everything. And I can tell you with confidence, if the people of Germany had my book in 1933, Hitler never would have come to power. The Nazi Party in 1933 got 37% of the vote, which was a plurality. Which eventually led him to come to power. And if they had read this book, they would have seen this guy's destructive. Even though he wouldn't have been named in the book at that time, they would have been able to see, as I can see, that he was inherently destructive, and they wouldn't have voted for him. Now, would he have gotten some votes? Of course. You know who would have voted for him? Psychopaths, sociopaths, crazy people, criminals, corrupt people. But that's not 37% of the electorate. It's not enough to get that kind of vote. So that's that scale, the scale of basic purposes. And as I said, that fifth level makes no sense. Most people do not understand that 20% of the population, which is how many people there are at that level, level 5, are out to sabotage themselves. And there's nothing you can do about it. Because when you try to help them, you're opposing the person's most basic purpose. So what kind of a reaction are you going to get? This is why people like Jesus get crucified. And Mahatma Gandhi got assassinated. And Abraham Lincoln got assassinated. Okay? Because people at the bottom of the scale, they don't want help to occur.
Wow. This is... I can't wait to get my hands on that, Jim, to read this thing. And as you're talking about it and discussing it, getting excited about getting it into my hands, because I'd love to really spend some time in this book to get a glimpse, at least, some of your revelations that you have, because getting a glimpse of it, I know, will set me free from many of the things. And that's all, what I'm about is learning. I want to learn more about who I am as an individual so that I can then look outside and learn about who is standing in front of me. But talk to me about how did you find meditation, Jim? How did you find that?
Well, first of all, I told you I was a natural born polymath and that I was intensely inquisitive about everything. So the fact that I learned something did not prevent me from learning something else, even if it was in the same space. For example, I grew up a Christian, like most Americans. But when I was in college, I met a girl who was a Buddhist. And she said, come to a prayer meeting. I said, okay. So I went, and then, of course, I studied it. And as I studied it, I was a very good student, and it rang a bell to me, okay? Similarly with Hinduism and Jainism and all the other things. For example, I read the Book of Mormon. You know how Mormon young men go around? I don't know if you bumped into these people. They go around in pairs, Okay, so some Mormon young men came to me and they said, read the book. I said, okay. They gave me the book. I read it. Okay. Didn't make me a Mormon, but I have respect for them. I understand parts of what they teach and practice. I practice. Okay. Elements of it. So you might say that I have a very syncretic approach to not only religion, but everything else. So the fact that, I do not think of things oppositionally. I think of things in an intellectual way. My motto is learn everything, believe nothing. None of it is about belief for me. For example, I actually live according to the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, there are many Christians who think I'm not a Christian. I don't belong to a church. I don't go to church anymore. And so there's, he's not a Christian. He meditates. A lot of Christians think that's a bad
Western
thing.
civilization,
Did you know that?
Jim, and I tell the difference in Eastern Christianity, which Jesus was a part of. Meditation is a part of that belief system. Western Christianity, Jim, believe that when you meditate, you're opening up yourself to get demons jump inside of you because they teach nonsense. If you look at the Word of God, it talks about meditation. It tells you ought to meditate on this word day and night, night and day. It is no different than anything else. I mean, Jesus did it. The disciples, you got to remember that where they came from and their culture at that time was meditation was a part of that culture. Now, in the culture of Western civilization in Eastern Europe and coming to the States and all that stuff, has nothing to do. We don't even know what that means. And so we attach, because of our foolish thinking, we attach nonsense into that, saying that, demons, because that's what they used to teach me when I was younger. I'm similar like you. I believe Jesus' word. I meditate all the time. I meditate an hour every day before I start get involved in anything else, because it is my time that I am having my conversation with my God and focusing on myself and who I am. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of Christians will think you and I are nuts because we're meditating, and that something is wrong with us. But if you look at the word says, it is a part of the word, Old and New Testament.
One of the things that I observed is that belief is a barrier to learning. Because once you believe something, anything that you get that opposes that, you tend to just dismiss. And dismissiveness is intrinsically antipathetic to learning. So for me, it's not about belief, it's about perception. In other words, I can perceive things. I can perceive the wisdom in the Ten Commandments. Okay? I'm not a Jew, although I have many close Jewish friends. And the Ten Commandments came from their tradition, from Moses. But it's not because I believe. It's because I perceive. And the best way I can explain this is, the person that I'm the most like is a fictional character, which is Sherlock Holmes. I am very much like Sherlock Holmes. I've read every Sherlock Holmes story in existence, most of them multiple times, and I've seen all the TV renderings and movies and everything else, all of them. And I first read this when I was 13, and I went right into it. But later in life, as I meditated more and my mind became clearer, I started realizing that I was very much like that. There's a place in one of those stories where his buddy Watson is asking him, how do you solve these crimes? How do you figure this out? And he said, well, let me ask you something. How many stairs are there that lead up to our apartment? They lived on the second floor. And Watson said, I don't know. And Holmes just said, you see, that's the difference between us. There are 17 stairs. You've come up those stairs as many times as I have, but you never noticed there were 17 steps. And that is what I do. I know that is exactly what is in the book. And that is how I am. I perceive things, and as the years went by, I got better and better. And that's how I discovered this subject, by perceiving my clients. You see, when I was working with my clients, I was focused like a laser on the person, to understand him, to have insight, to know what question I should ask him next, to see what was happening with him. Is this a person who's upset, or is he worried? See, that's not the same thing. If he's worried, I would handle it one way, and if he's upset, I'll handle it another way. Or is this a guy who's keeping a secret? That's a different thing. And of course, I use biofeedback, which helped me to sort this out, because every thought that you have has an electronic phenomenon connected with it, and it shows up as resistance if you connect the person up to a galvanic skin response meter. And so I learned what thoughts or what types of thoughts went with which phenomena on the meter. So that was part of the insight that helped me. So I could see where the session was going long before it got there. And that means I could either steer it that way, or I could head it off if it was going the wrong way. And all of that led me to observe these steps that the clients would manifest, which I wrote down and which I discovered in 1995. The whole fact that they were all 7 level all came to me in a few months. And then I worked with it for 25 years, researching and rewriting it and inspecting it and meditating on it to get to a deeper understanding. For example, there's a scale called the scale of, let me think of a good one, the scale of permeation. Most people don't know anything about permeation. Permeation is the basic activity of a spiritual being. The reason why we get sensations off our bodies is that we are permeating them as a spiritual being. When the person dies, he stops permeating his body. He no longer gets sensation from it. The body is dead, okay? So that is what happened. The permeation ended. Now, when you see two people who are deeply in love, they are permeating one another at a very high level. Okay, so permeation undercuts love and hate. The highest level of it is where you have the most power. You have real power from the fact that you're permeating it so well. Like, for example, Monet, brilliant painter, okay? Hundreds and hundreds of brilliant paintings. He obviously was permeating on a very high level painting. I'm not much of a painter at all, so my permeation on it is at a lower level. So the lowest level of permeation is when you have hatred. Okay? When people hate one another, they're not permeating one another at all. Now, some people think of this as compassion or empathy, but the underlying thing is a spiritual thing. I mean, how do angels communicate? They have no brains even. They permeate things. And what is permeation about? It's about perception. When you permeate something, your perception goes up, which is why you often have telepathic communication between people of high permeation. And where you have really no connection at all between people who won't permeate one another. So that is an axis that I had to divine. What is this thing? And I had to get to the deeper truth of, okay, this is about permeation. I mean, I had the concept of permeation, but then I realized it occurs in the scale. And if you study the scale, you'll see it has a mathematical phenomena built into it. All the scales have mathematics built into them, although I tried not to make that the center of focus because not everybody knows math, but it's in there. And I explain when you look at the matrix that explains each scale, you can see the mathematical aspects of it.
That's awesome. Jim, I want to thank you for coming by Threads of Enlightenment. This has been impactful in so many ways. And again, I mentioned it to you, listeners, buy the book. I'm going to get me one as well. I think I may buy me a couple because I got a couple of sons that I think I need them to have it as well. So I suggest you guys just buy a couple of copies and hand them out, man. Jim, I want to again thank you for coming by Threads of Enlightenment. This has been really, really good. Thank you, sir.
And I just want to say in closing, I invite everybody to go to my website, septemics.com. There's a massive amount of information. You can look at it. You can find out how people have responded to reading it, what people have written about it, what the reviews are. You can read part of the book, and you can find out what this is about. I invite you to go and realize this book exists hardbound, softbound, and ebook. The ebook is very inexpensive, like all ebooks. So for a very small investment, you can change your whole life.
Thank you.